Since pre-patch has just begun and we likely won't be getting many more drastic changes to tanks, I want to go over my top 3 tanks leading into the War Within. I made a video going over the gameplay of each tanks, but I wanted to go a little more in depth into the strengths and weaknesses of my top 3. So let's get started. Starting with third place is Blood DK. When I first played BDK after the changes, I did not like it at all, but after playing it a little bit and becoming more comfortable with the changes, I think it sits in a strong third. I think it's one of the tanks that if you've been playing for a while and know how it plays, you're comfortable playing with it, it feels second nature, then you can put it higher up. But for the average player, I think it's a comfortable third. Blood DK is a very strong tank with a lot of self-sustain, short cooldowns, and really strong burst damage. With the recent changes to Bone Storm, it now reduces the cooldown on Dancing Rune Weapon, which was a massive increase for Dancing Rune Weapon uptime. Combined with Tombstone, you can have DRW for nearly every pull. This has been a great change for BDK because at least for me, the toughest part about Blood is entering the pull. Your ramp to being stable is extremely dangerous and can lead to a quick death, so being able to enter a pull with increased parry, an easily stackable bone shield, and additional runic power generation makes the window a lot safer. Although Blood DK doesn't give much group utility in the traditional sense of buffs like Lust or Mark of the Wild, it does bring some unique and beneficial abilities. Death Grip is an excellent way to pull in mobs. Abomination Limb is fantastic for gathering adds on bosses or even spread out packs. If you're talented into it, Gorfiend's Grasp provides an additional way to both stack mobs and interrupt casting. Additionally, Anti-Magic Zone is an extremely strong group defensive against consistent magic damage, and Anti-Magic Shell is probably one of the best defenses for big incoming magic damage. On top of all that, they also come with a battle res. Played well, the Blood DK could be a very strong tank in the War Within. Now what are the weaknesses? As I mentioned before, the ramp to being stable can be extremely dangerous. Blood DK is based around taking large amounts of incoming damage and healing for large amounts with Death Strike. With the recent changes to Death Strike, you really need to use it properly. Previously, Death Strike would heal you for a percentage of the damage taken in the past 5 seconds. If you use 2 back to back, the second one would pull from the previous damage taken. However, now Death Strike essentially resets its damage taken amount when you use it. Meaning if you use 2 back to back, the first will give you the full benefit of the past 5 seconds of damage, while the second will only heal for a percentage of the damage taken between your first cast and your second cast, making the second Death Strike extremely ineffective and a waste of runic power, unless you are taking huge amounts of damage. If you take 80% of your health in between those 2 globals, you will still get a benefit from your second one and you will still generate a lot of health. But in lower damage pulls, you can no longer simply spam Death Strike to jump your health back up because you need to be taking damage in between your Death Strikes. Basically, unless you're taking high consistent damage, it feels like Death Strike has a 3 to 5 second internal cooldown where you need to wait and build up damage taken to get the full use of each successive Death Strike. If used wrong, you can find yourself in a tight spot quickly. This also means that healers will have to get more used to healing a Death Knight and understanding their yo-yoing health a bit more, which is something that they never really had to do. There is always that old saying that if you spent a heal on a Death Knight, you wasted that heal. Now, not so much the case. You will need a little bit of healing as a Death Knight. Secondly, your self-sustain is just that, it's completely on you. Most tanks have a get out of jail free card or enough CDs to make them tanky enough to be healed through bad situations. Blood DKs typically just die if they cannot keep themselves up. Whether it's a bad Death Strike resulting in low healing and wasted runic power or improper use of CDs, Blood DKs are punished much more than any other tank for bad play. Every global counts for Blood Death Knights. Lastly, and this is the flaw that's old as time, it's the one-shot deaths that DK suffer from in higher keys. In most keys you won't experience this, but as you push higher and higher up, the threat becomes very real. Now I know most people say just use a defensive or rune tap into every pull, but the problem isn't something you prepare for in counterplay. The problem is something as simple as you AoE stun mid-fight to stop cast, all the mobs sync up and swing at the same time and one-shot the DK. You can't have defensives up for every stun. Most tanks sit at higher health using defensives and maintenance buff to reduce incoming damage, but when you're playing DK, you're relying on taking large amounts of damage and healing through them after they hit. When that large amount of damage becomes simply more than your health, there's just nothing you can do. In second place, we have Arcane Bear. Arcane Bear is in second place for a couple of reasons. First, let's talk about defensives. Guardian Druid has several solid defensives with pretty short cooldowns that allow you to rotate through them a bit more freely than other tanks. Defensives like Bark Skin is a great example, 30% damage reduction, 20% more healing received, and on a 34 to 45 second cooldown depending on talents. This is something you can utilize every pull in a dungeon and a great way to buy time to get your Iron Fur up, your Moonfires out, and your Lunar Beam rolling. Frenzied Regeneration is another one. It did take a hefty nerf in the latest build, but healing 20% of your health and 20% increased healing received in a 3-second window on a 30-second cooldown with 2 charges is still a fairly strong self-sustainability. Let's not focus on what it was before, let's focus on what it is now. Additionally, bears have very high health and very high armor. With Arcane Bear, you don't utilize raise and pulls, instead you spend rage on Iron Fur, which allows you to stay just about armor capped in almost every pull. They do decent damage, it's not beating Blood DK, but not many are. It does make up for it in other categories, so let's talk about utility. Right now, other druid specs are hurting a bit, so bringing a bear tank also gives you Mark of the Wild, which is a nice buff in dungeons. 3% verse means more damage done and less damage taken. They come with a battle res, which is always great to have on the tank because most of the time if the tank dies it's a wipe, but if somebody else dies the tank can get them up fairly quickly and the fight can continue. So it's always nice when the tank has a battle res. They also have kind of a long range interrupt. Skull Bash has a 13-yard range on it, and although they have to charge the target, so it does mean charging and backpedaling, it does make it easier to interrupt targets at range than any tank with a melee interrupt having to run over. Instead, they simply charge over and back up. They have Incapacitating Roar as well, which with all the casters in the War Within dungeon becomes very beneficial. On top of that, they have Typhoon to move packs, or you can combo it with Ursol's Fury and make it basically another AoE stun, but it does have some duration to it, which is good for those mobs that instantly cast right after a stop. Rather than stopping and having them immediately cast again, they have to go through the animation of being knocked back and pulled back in, so it does buy you a little bit of time. They also have Stampeding Roar, increasing the movement speed of your party, which is a nice boost to get to the next pack in a dungeon and can help slower classes get out of AoEs. They also have Remove Curse and Remove Poison, which is proving to be something you use quite often in the dungeons in War Within. Additionally, they do have a Soothe, which is a nice added benefit. So overall, they do have a laundry list of utilities they can bring to keys, both buffing the group and helping control mobs. Now let's talk self-sustain. Even after the nerfs, Arcane Bear has incredibly high self-healing. I was still able to break well over 1 million healing per second in the first key I did after the nerf. Lunar Beam being on a short cooldown and being cooldown reduced with arcane abilities means you have it up every pull, sometimes multiple times a pull, which really helps pump up your self-healing. Also, because you gain leech based on targets in your beam, you do get a bit of scaling as the packs gets bigger, which makes those big pulls feel not as dangerous. With all your arcane abilities healing you, random proccing Moonfires on 2 targets, procs for 300% increased Moonfire, and Thrash being an arcane ability, you are quite the self-sufficient tank. And most of it feels very passive. It doesn't feel like you have to go out of your way to get the most out of your healing. Lastly, it's extremely easy to play. Because Arcane Bear doesn't utilize Raise and all your rage is spent on Iron Fur, it becomes a very simple rotation. Mangle, Thrash, Iron Fur, Moonfire. It's not recommended because manually hitting Iron Fur is just good practice, but I have Iron Fur macroed into my Mangle and Thrash and I don't even need to think about it. And I know that I'm typically going to be at very high Iron Fur stacks, typically at armor cap. So if you're looking to try out tanking, Arcane Bear is going to be a great pick. Now for the weaknesses. Something I noticed across the beta, but more so on druids than any other tank, is threat generation. Because of how we build without raise, we really only have one AoE ability, which is Thrash, and Thrash has a 5-second cooldown. If you're lucky, on pull you can proc a couple Galactic Guardians and get some free threat, but against big burst classes like Mage, Warrior, or even Ret Pally, it can cause a scramble to get everything under control. Lunar Beam would be better if it appeared on your target, but it appears on you, so you need to initiate the pull before you use it, and that's when everyone starts blasting. I'd like to see Thrash get a boost on Threat. I think Threat in retail is a bit outdated. It hardly ever matters until it does and people die. Secondly, their class tree is pretty bad. Having 4 specs blended into a class tree means there's a lot of useless talents, there's a lot of filler, and about half the tree you don't even take. I'd love to see a balanced Resto tree and a Feral Guardian tree, but that seems unlikely. The only saving grace for Arcane Bear is we can utilize some of the balance aspects of the class tree, but it still needs a fix. I've said it before, so I won't go too far into it, but anytime you need to invest all your talent points to simply use your hero talents, it feels bad. Now, luckily we are using all those talents to benefit our hero tree, so it could be worse, but I think it sets a bad precedent to utilize a capstone talent to unlock your hero talents. Lastly, their healing is very good, but there's a bit of a ramp time that can feel dangerous, and this has been expanded by the recent nerfs. Additionally, Lunar Beam is healing you based on the damage you deal to targets in your beam. So if you have to move and you move the targets out of your beam, you do take a big hit to your self-healing. So positioning is very important to get the maximum out of your self-healing as Bear, and it can also be very punishing if you have to move. That being said, their utility, self-sustain, defensives, and ease of play puts it in an easy second place for me for tanks in the War Within. Now before we go into my first place pick for tanks in the War Within, I want to hit an honorable mention. Prot Warriors. Prot Warriors feel really good to play. They're very tanky and Spell Reflect can have a huge impact on dungeons. The problem is they're extremely reliant on healers. They weren't too bad before the nerfs, but after them you do feel a loss of self-sustain and the healers feel a bit more pressure. Plus, as good as Spell Reflect is in certain dungeons, it's absolutely useless in others, and it's a large portion of your damage. Even though they're extremely strong against physical damage, they're kind of weak against magic, and that's where most of the big damage comes from. So because of that, they didn't quite make it into the top 3, but there will be dungeons that Warrior definitely shines. We already see it in a couple of the dungeons in beta, where Spell Reflect is such a large portion of damage and so hugely impactful on bosses that Warriors will still get play. But as far as overall tanks, I don't think they're quite top 3. Alright, on to my number 1 pick. If you watch my streams, you already know it's coming. Brewmaster Monk. Brewmaster has felt the strongest it has in a long time. It's easily my favorite tank to play, but I'm going to try to remain unbiased in its strengths and weaknesses. First, if you're playing Brewmaster in Dragonfight and planning to play it in the War Within, you'll notice they did cut down on a lot of the button bloat that was in Dragonflight. There's still a lot to press, but it's much more manageable and a breath of fresh air in comparison. Let's talk about something unique to Brews, Stagger. Stagger is how Brewmaster can survive with only one big defensive. Brew takes all the damage it takes and spreads it out over time, meaning instead of a 5 million hit blasting you in one go, it's spread out over 10 seconds, making tank busters significantly more manageable than they are with any other tank. Stagger to me feels like the damage profile that Blizz is trying to reach with all tanks. High sustained but stable incoming damage. In the recent changes, monks actually got a buff to their stagger, increasing their physical stagger by 8% and the amount of magic damage they stagger by 13%, pushing us to 58% magic stagger. This was actually huge for monks, as now we take less than half the initial magic damage up front. You feel this not only on tank busters but in every pull throughout the dungeon. Entering a pull feels so much less dangerous when the initial damage you take isn't blasted into you immediately. You have time to position and stabilize easier than any other tank. Brewmaster is easily the baseline tankiest of all the tanks. Now for utility. Brewmaster, like Death Knight, doesn't bring typical buffs to dungeons. However, if you do happen to have a melee heavy group, which seems like it might be a little rare, it does bring a 5% damage buff to the entire party with Mystic Touch. They also bring a poison and disease cleanse to the group, which is great in the War Within, and can help the healers out on bosses like the last one in City of Echoes. Following the trend, interrupts are very important as well, and monks come with 4: Kick, Paralysis, Leg Sweep, and Ring of Peace. Granted, Paralysis is a stop that most mobs will immediately cast again, but that second or two can be the difference in your healer getting a cast off or not. Now with the recent changes, affixes are significantly better in the War Within, but even the affixes we have now are very easy for a monk to take care of. On the Orb affix, monks can single-handedly take care of all the orbs with 2 different abilities: Leg Sweep if the rings are close, or Ring of Peace if they're at range. On the Void Emissary, Brewmasters can Touch of Death every other emissary, or even multiple in a row if there's downtime in between pulls like in City of Threads. Now a lot of players can take care of the Orb affix, so that's not too big of a deal, but being able to one-shot the Void Emissary has come in handy in several occasions. Times where the emissary is spawning at the end of a pull, you can quickly nuke and move on, you don't have to wait and fight. If it spawns in a bad position, you can tap it and get back to where you need to be. For example, on the second boss of Siege, if she's not being meleeed, she begins attacking random targets with Gutshot. This can mean that the emissary off in the distance can be a real problem. Rather than everybody moving off the boss, you can Transcendence, roll to the affix, Touch of Death, and teleport back and minimize downtime. You don't need the whole party to move to the affix in order to kill it, you just need you. Now I know it might feel minor because we're killing the affixes anyways, it's not really a big deal, but the times where it is a big deal makes this a very, very beneficial move to have, and a really good reason to have a monk in the group. As far as self-sustaining, monks do quite well. When you use Purifying Brew, you clear 60% of damage delayed with Stagger and heal for 25% of the damage cleared, giving you a pretty consistent big self-heal, considering Purifying Brew can have a cooldown as low as 16 seconds, with multiple moves reducing it further. On top of that, you have 2 charges of Celestial Brew, which can shield you for upwards of 3 million at max Purifying Chi stacks. You also have Gift of the Ox, dropping healing orbs all around you that heal for 200k apiece, and Chi Burst, which does good damage and heals you and allies for 200k. Lastly, Expel Harm, which at its base isn't a very big heal. but it increases up to 100% based on missing health and pulls in all the healing orbs around you to raise it even more, and it can become a pretty sizable heal. All of these things working together with Stagger makes your self-healing feel substantial. Lastly, and this might change from beta to live, but Threat is a bit of an issue right now across all tanks, but Brew does a great job of managing it. With plenty of AoE abilities, you can very easily enter the pack and control them, even with glasses blasting away the second you roll in. You have the occasional runner, but overall the experience has been very good. Brew so far has excelled in every tank situation, whether it's magical or physical damage. Brewmaster handles it well. They bring solid interrupts to the group, a nice damage buff to melee, they can take care of affixes quickly and effectively, and overall feel very strong going into the War Within. Now for the weaknesses. There's a bit of a learning curve to Brew. Purifying Brew generates purified chi stacks based off the amount of stagger you clear with it. The higher the stagger cleared, the higher stacks you generate. The higher stacks you have, the bigger your Celestial Brew shield is, meaning you need to find a balance between Purifying Brew usage and Celestial Brew usage to make sure you're maximizing stacks generated and shield generated. If you blast through 2 Purifying Brews too early, your Celestial Brew shield will be significantly weaker. If you blast through your Celestial Brews too early, you won't have time to build up a big shield. It can be a bit of a back and forth at first. Next, you only have one real defensive, which means improper use of brews can leave you, and no pun intended, pretty defenseless. It's quite a strong defensive and can get you out of trouble, but with the 4-minute cooldown, it's not something you'll have every pull, so you need to use it wisely along with your brews. Now, as I mentioned before, we did get a reduction in buttons, which overall was a good change, but you do feel it a little bit in your damage. Brews still does pretty solid damage, but with abilities becoming more passive, we did lose a bit of it. Also, it's worth mentioning there still is quite a few buttons to hit in your rotation, probably more than most tanks, if not all the tanks. Provided we don't see any more drastic changes leading into the War Within, these are going to be my top 3 recommendations for tanks. Blood Death Knight is a solid 3rd place, very strong when played well, high damage, and has good utility. However, it does have its flaws, and with the recent changes, it makes it a little bit more difficult to play. Then you have Arcane Bear in 2nd. They're very easy to play, they're very tanky, they have a solid list of defensives, and they have good self-sustain. The downside is their threat leaves something to be desired, and a large portion of your self-healing requires being inside Lunar Beam, which means if you need to move because of AoE, or if you need to move because a patrol is coming, you can lose out on a lot of healing quickly and put yourself in a dangerous position. First place is Brewmaster. They excel in most content, have solid group utility, solid interrupts, they can handle affixes quite well, and their self-sustainability is great. I'll be playing Brew on stream a lot leading up to the beta, so hop in anytime and check out some Brew gameplay. Until next time, guys.